Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. I'm Mr. 50mm. In today's episode of The Ramblings, the fourth one, we're going to just go over a quick budget camera ranking. We're going to split it up into two groups, APS-C or smaller and full frame. Now, I'm kind of just going at this fairly generally, kind of in the approach of if someone just came up and asked, hey, I have some dollars. What would be your top four or so suggestions for cameras that I should consider buying? That kind of mentality. So we're not going to be like, hey, what's the top four mirrorless cameras or top four, vintage or older CCD DSLRs. We're just going to go generally, I would like a camera for X amount of dollars. We're going to try to keep the cameras all under $600 Canadian. And yeah, just keep in mind that this is all just my opinion and what I think and what I would suggest. So, if you have disagreements or whatever, you can comment down below at the end of the video or watch first, comment if you have any disagreements kind of deal. But yeah, that's what this one's going to be about. So let's get into it. All right, we're going to start with APS-C or smaller cameras. So we're going to start number 4. So for number 4, I would suggest the Nikon D200. So some of you may know this is a nearly perfect camera, at least in my opinion. Now, why would I give a camera that I think is nearly perfect the 4th position? Well, has to do mainly with its age. The D200 is at this point almost 20 years old. And while it is really awesome, it is a CC enabled camera and it has Nikon F mount, glass support. It is inevitably quite old. And if someone were to ask me generally what would I recommend to them, the first go-to wouldn't be a 20-year-old camera. Not withstanding a couple asterisks. And that would be if someone came and asked for a camera that was very cheap and had a large category or catalog of lenses. Then this would come in pretty clutch. The D200, after all, can be had for an extraordinarily low price, usually on the order of around 150 Canadian dollars, probably less, probably more closer to like $100 Canadian, so maybe 75 USD. And for that value, you can save quite a bit of money and focus some efforts into getting some glass. And on top of that, it's an F-mount camera, so you can get vintage glass of the pre-AI era and newer, and it'll meter just fine. So there's plenty of options for how you can shoot this camera, and that's mainly why it makes it to the number 4 spot. Yes, I know there are other Nikon DSLRs probably in a similar price range for for options, but I personally think with the nearly perfect handling of the D200, I would suggest those over some of the newer Nikon DSLRs in that price bracket. In the number 3 spot, we have the Olympus EM5 Mark I. Now, why do I think this earns a number 3? Well, first, it uses a fairly modern 16 megapixel sensor. It's the one that Panasonic and Olympus had been using for quite some time, even though this one was introduced fairly early on in the game. That being said, the camera takes the top 3 or 3rd spot, partly because of how nice and small it is, and despite that, it is a fairly comfortable camera to hold. The Micro Four Thirds system means that you have a pretty good library now of fairly small Micro Four Thirds lenses. They autofocus fairly well, and a lot of them aren't that expensive for some pretty good quality glass, like the one that I'm currently shooting on right now, which is the 14mm f2.5. It is quite nice and really not that expensive. So overall, for someone looking for a budget camera, the Olympus EM5 Mark I offers a fairly good overall system in that you can get fairly cheap glass. The camera itself is very cheap. You can find EM5 Mark I's for around 150 to 200 USD. And that's a fairly good price for a modern shooting experience. On top of that, if you want to save some more money, you don't necessarily have to use the Olympus Micro Four Thirds lenses. Again, it's a mirrorless camera, so you could adapt almost any lens to it, which might save you some more money. And if you are into older glass, that's a bonus. The camera does also shoot video as well, so if you do have a hankering to try some video shooting, this could do it. Again, it's limited to, I believe, 1080p, so it's nothing super special. Okay, so my number 2 pick is this camera here. Sorry, I'm not holding one. It's because I'm shooting on it. It's the Panasonic GH4. Now, why would I recommend the GH4? It's commonly known as a video camera, and that it is. And that's part of the reason. But the other part is that it can also take photos. Did you know that? And it will do it using, again, a 16 megapixel sensor, much like the Olympus OMD EM5 Mark I that came in third place. The camera is a little newer, also being introduced in 2014. And it's also not super expensive, given it is a camera that still shoots fairly relevant 4K footage. I got mine for around $425, but I've seen these go for as low as 350 Canadian buckaroos. I do admit that's a bit on the low end. You're probably more likely to get it in the $400 range. So in general, around 300, 10 USD or so. I double check these conversions. They're just kind of generally popping in out of my head. But that's the ballpark range. So it's not that expensive. Again, it lets you have a wide array of options for lens selections. And, if you want to adapt to manual focus stuff, there's that as well. And really, I can't really overstate the fact that this camera can shoot 4K video, and it shoots excellent 4K video at that. And if you're not into 4K and you just want to shoot 1080, it also does that pretty good. So there's that. The caveat is autofocus is not the greatest system for video, but for $400-ish dollars, could do worse. But yeah, that's my number 2 pick. So what is my number 1 pick for best budget camera in the APSC or smaller category? Would someone give me a drum roll? I don't have anyone. Anyways, it's the Sony a6000. Now, I know, this is a lot of mirrorless camera stuff. Where are my DSLRs at? Now, the unfortunate reality is, mirrorless cameras are kind of the thing now. For better or for worse, overall, for better, I think. The A6000 is a fairly nice camera. Again, it has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor. It is from 2014 as well. And this was post the Sony Nex series bodies. So Sony actually learned from these that buttons and command dials and well-shaped camera grips, they matter. And the A6000 does have a lot of those. So it's a pretty good, well-rounded camera. I personally do not own one, otherwise I'd be holding it over here. But rest assured, it's a fairly solid unit. After all, this camera has had several iterations at this point. The camera Yeah, it's Sony E-mount. So it's a mature platform with a lot of lens options, first party and third party. And in terms of third party budget options, there's an incredible amount of lenses that are very good value. They perform very well, and generally you can have your pick and pick any focal length you want, and you can probably have it in like almost any aperture that you want for not a huge amount of money. So overall, as a system, the E-mount system I think is an excellent budget category. I've got a couple like Viltrox lenses, some Samyang lenses, all that I've got for fairly low amounts of money, and they all perform fairly good. Sure, they're not as good as Sony G Master lenses or whatnot, but for a lot of them, I paid 150 bucks Canadian for it, and autofocuses as well. Optically, it performs not bad. So, you know, it's a good package overall. And for someone that's budget conscious, I think it's a very good fit. On top of that, again, being a mirrorless E-mount camera, you could adapt almost any lens you want to it. Leica M-mount, Pentax M42. Heck, do you want autofocusing EF glass on your Sony camera? That's an option too. And I would recommend that as well if you do have some Canon glass that you want to use. I'm currently using the Sigma EF adapter, and I find it fairly good. That caveat being, though, it doesn't work that well or at all on some third-party lenses, some older ones. Because I've got an older Tamron 28-75, a very old one, and it does not play nice. For whatever reason, it does not like to actually do the focusing thing. But for native EF lenses, it focuses on the E-mount cameras just fine. So because of that, and because of the fact that the camera can be had now for fairly good price of around 500 Canadian dollars, maybe around 550 if you want to get one that's like a minty or with a kit lens or something. It's a very good value camera. In fact, the other day I was actually around one of the local pawn shops, and there was one sitting there with kit lens for $400 Canadian. I admit that was a bit of an anomaly, but you can probably find similar deals online in your marketplace if you look hard enough. So yeah, there you have it. My top 4 APS-C cameras. Number 1 being the Sony A6000. On to the full frame offerings. So we're going to start third place going upward. The third place camera being the Canon 5D Classic. Now, it primarily makes it in the third place just because this camera is so dang cheap. I got mine for a fairly low price from Japanland. Around $225 or so. Not super sure. You can double check in my review that I'll put in a link down below, possibly in the link up above. But it was very cheap. For a full frame camera, that's quite crazy. On average, though, you can find them for around 175 to 250 USD. With the cheaper ones probably looking more like my copy, being a bit banged up, and the more expensive one looking a little more pristine. Now, I know 5DC, it's only in third place. Why is that? Well, part of it is the age. The camera is quite old at this point, and despite it being quite a lovely camera and still outputting very nice 12 megapixel photos, there are compromises to be made. One, I know I don't normally talk about resolution, but in the case of people asking for advice for a little more money, I would offer up my option 1 or 2 instead. I know it's not that the 5D Mark 1, 5D Classic is so cheap that it's kind of crazy. But if someone were asking now, what would I offer, or what advice would I offer? if someone were looking for a full frame camera, the first one to come to mind wouldn't be the 5DC. Again, unless their top priority was budget. But again, if you are looking for a full frame camera, 5DC is my number 3 because it still makes really good photos. You do have to live with some of the older things. For example, no auto ISO on this camera. It is a regular DSLR with a flappy mirror. Not a bad thing. You get a nice optical finder, but you also don't get a nice high resolution screen. You get a 230K dot unit on the back. You do also got to use compact flash cards, which should have mentioned that in the Nikon D200. So if you don't know what those are, maybe don't look at getting one of these cameras. And with the 5D Mark 1 specifically, I did notice there are quite a few of these that are quite a bit beat up. I know for more money you can find a nicer one, but a lot of these lower cost units, they have seen tough days. But if you don't mind that and value is your number one priority, 5DC could be it. Plus, you get access to a large variety of EF lenses, and it being a EF mount camera, you can adapt a whole variety of other lenses to it. Not as much as a mirrorless, but pretty close to it. If you want to shoot Nikon vintage glass, go for it. Adapter is about $12 or something. You want to shoot M42 screw mount lenses, that's an option as well. I think even what other ones? I believe there is a Pentax K-mount adapter. So many adapters. The EF mount is quite versatile. And, this is also one of the picks because it is a DSLR. So you get an optical finder. But, take into account that age. So for the number 2 full frame camera recommendation, it's the Nikon D600, another DSLR. It's got a flappy mirror, but it's considerably newer than the 5D Mark II. It features a very contemporary 24 megapixel CMOS sensor, and the output from this sensor is still phenomenal. Holds up against most cameras now. I think the only area where it might fall down a bit is high ISO, but even there, it does a good job. On top of that, this camera isn't that expensive. You can find these units for around 400 to 500 Canadian dollars, about 300 to 360 USD or so. It's not a totally uncommon price. Some units will be a little higher, some units may be a bit lower, but on the whole, these are fairly cheap full-frame DSLRs. Again, there are some things to take note of. Again, from my review, this camera had some baggage from it when it was new. There was that potential for oil spots to appear on the sensor. At this point, given the camera's age, it's unlikely that those cameras still are around, but always have a check before you buy. That being said, the D600 otherwise is an excellent camera. Modern shooting experience, at least as modern as a DSLR basically gets. Again, you get a nice optical viewfinder. It's a Nikon F-mount camera, so you can mount anything from Nikon AI and newer. It'll drive screw mount lenses. It'll drive the lenses with built-in motors, and there's a fairly nice library of third-party lenses as well. The Nikon D600 also ergonomically is very nice. There's, I think, a fairly good control layout. Again, not as perfect as a D200, but pretty close. So yeah, that's my number 2. So what's my number 1 full-frame camera pick? Well, it's this right here. Alright, it's also another camera that I don't currently own. It is the Sony A7 Mark I. Now, I know, it's another mirrorless camera that took the number 1 spot. But why is that? Well, there's a couple reasons. One, it is also equipped with a 24 megapixel sensor, so it is contemporary, so it keeps up with contemporary cameras in the resolution front. It's also fairly modern, and again, being a mirrorless camera, you can adapt whatever lenses you want. So if shooting with autofocus stuff isn't to your liking, you can adapt whatever vintage class you would like. And if autofocus is your liking and you still need to stretch your budget, there are a ton of third-party lenses for the system that aren't super expensive. Some of them cost less money than an EF autofocus adapter. Again, the prime examples that come to mind are a bunch of stuff from Viltrox or Samyang, and they perform fairly well. So in all, for not a huge amount of money, you can get a whole full-frame system with third-party lenses that take pretty good photos. That being said, the A7 Mark I is likely the most expensive suggestion of the lot. I've seen some go for around $500 to $600 Canadian. So we're looking at around like $400 USD to like $450 or whatnot, which is, I admit, more than the other cameras. But for that, you get a camera that you could likely keep for a fairly long time. Again, it's able to mount quite a bit of glass, and it leaves you a lot of room if you want to buy new lenses that are currently being made, which can't be said for the other systems. The Canon 5D Classic and the Nikon D600, those camera and camera mounts, if they aren't discontinued, they are currently on their way out. I know for EF, the Canon is not supporting the mount anymore, and Nikon keeps adding more and more f-mount lenses into their archived section on their webpage. So sooner or later, that mount will be unsupported. But with the Sony E-mount, that has plenty of life in it. So if you do decide that you want to, upgrade to another E-mount camera, all your lenses are still able to be used with all their functionality. No compromises. Now, I understand you can also mount your Nikon or Canon glass if you were to get into RF or Z system, but you can also mount your EF glass and some Nikon glass onto an E-mount system as well, as there's active work in those areas. The EF to E-mount adapter is quite good, and I believe there is a Nikon autofocus adapter in the works. And I do believe there is one that has a motor in it, so it can drive screw mount Nikon lenses, something that the Z cameras cannot yet do. So, yeah, my number one pick, Sony A7 Mark I. Right, so that's my, camera ranking for APS-C and smaller, as well as full-frame lenses. What do you think of my suggestions? Do you agree? Disagree? What would you suggest if someone asked you the same question? And why? Now, again, if I did not list a camera here that you agree on, that you think should be, leave a comment down below and let me know, again, what you would suggest. Otherwise, as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time. Bye.